Hi, I'm Brenda Such. Welcome to COIPcast, where we talk about new, trending, or just fascinating technologies in online education. In this episode, we tackle a practice that impacts not only online students, but also all students: information retention. How do we ensure that the information presented to students is received in a way that they can remember and apply in and outside of their courses? Joining me today is Dr. Joslyn Ahlgren, who is an instructional professor and the undergraduate coordinator in the Department of Applied Physiology and Kinesiology. Welcome, Dr. Ahlgren.
Thanks for having me, Brenda. I'm super excited to talk about this with you.
Yes, we're going to have a good time. All right, Dr. Ahlgren, we like to get to know the past, present, and potentially future you. So we'll go through 3 segments: digital origin story, which is also DOS, bits and bytes, and tech forward, which will help us travel through this journey together. So in our first segment, digital origin story, or DOS again, could you please share what were your first memories with online education?
So my first memories with online education were being forced to do it because I was presented with the opportunity to do it. And I was like, no, I didn't want to do that. That sounds awful. You can't teach anatomy online.
And sorry to interrupt, how long ago was that, roughly?
10, 11 years ago, a little while ago.
Okay.
And so I was still in the new-ish part of my faculty journey. So very junior, very green. And even though I had been a TA for a long time, I had been teaching lots, still felt pretty new to being a faculty, and I was just very not for it. I was like, no, we can't do these types of physical things online. Online education is terrible. It's the downfall of society. I was really dramatic about it. But I was essentially told, nope, we're doing this, and since you teach it, you're doing it. And I was like, oh, okay, I guess. So I was very grumpy about it. However, I met with the instructional designer that I was assigned, Chris Pinkeson, and he was amazing.
Shout out, Chris.
Shout out, Chris. And he really kind of opened my eyes to this being a creative outlet, which I found really fascinating and really satisfying. And he kind of helped me explore ways that I could do what I like to do, but in an online platform, which was also really cool to learn about. And so then it kind of like sparked my little I like to learn thing that teachers have. And I was like, oh, this is actually, I'm in. And from that point, as I kind of started really doing the online learning development stuff, I started really appreciating how organized it was. You got to do everything in advance, and everything has to line up with this. And when you learn the course mapping stuff, like they all have to line up. And I teach anatomy, and the reason I teach anatomy is because it's super organized, and like that works for my brain. And it was just firing on all cylinders. I was like, check. This is for me.
Yes.
So I didn't want to do it first, but now I really love doing it.
Got it. So now that we know 10, 11 years past Dr. Ahlgren, we're moving on to our next segment, which is Bits and Bytes, where we talk about tidbits or technical issues. Online students can be presented with a lot of content that they have to navigate through and learn. And like what you just mentioned, it can be part of the planning process. So then how do you come up with a system or that practice when you're mapping of not just presenting contents to students, but even how they can retain that information and or just remember it, not just maybe for a test, but for the long run?
Yeah. So I teach predominantly anatomy-based classes.
Which is a lot.
It is a lot. It's a ton
lot
of stuff. Like there's a lot of memorization and a lot of structures and a lot of parts of structures. I mean, in anatomy, if we can name it, we do name it. If we can break it into smaller parts and name those too, we will. And we do this all the way down to the molecular level and all the way out to this whole system level, right? So there's a lot of layers there. There's a lot of names there. There's a lot of interchangeable things there, right? We can call one structure 3 or 4 different things, and they all generally get used, so we have to know them all. So it's also the type of class that you learn early in your education, and you don't get another shot at it until much later in your education, if again. So for me, when I started teaching anatomy, it was very, very important to design for retention. I need this to be something that if my students take this as a freshman or sophomore in undergrad, and they are not going to see anatomy again until their first or second year of post-baccalaureate education, then I need this to like at least a chunk of it to stick around so that they can like last. And so some of the things that I intentionally do for retention purposes, and this is true for my online sections as well as my residential sections, is I build up the early sections in such a way that I can lean on them in later sections. So we do a lot of tissues and like cells and stuff around the cells type of stuff early, and then we use that chapter in particular in every single other chapter. Even if it's not super direct and it's not on your learning objectives, it's not going to be a test question, I will ask them in lecture. And I do this in my online lectures as well. I will propose the question. I'll answer it afterwards sometimes, not always. But if I ask the question, what tissue is that made of? They have to reach back for it. And some students don't, but some students do. And if they can, then I'm like, yeah, you should feel so smart. Don't you feel good? That was chapter 4, y'all. We're in chapter 18.
Wow, you guys remembered.
But it's really nice, and it facilitates like a really nice vibe. And we do that for the entire semester. So I just pummel them with questions that require they reach back. You have to reach back for stuff in previous chapters. Tissues is one example. Any kind of medical terminology from a previous chapter, right? If we're talking about this parietal thing here, where have you heard that word before? Do you remember where that, what structure, what system, like where did that come from? What did it mean there? Does it mean the same thing here? So I build in a lot of questions that require them to really pull from things they've done before, which is also really helpful for getting them to put 2 and 2 together, right? Asking students to add meaning to what they are learning is also really, really helpful for retention. So when I do this, I feel like I'm kind of 2 birds, 1 stone.
So how do you plan all that? I mean, on the one hand, there's the higher level mapping, but when you're going into a lecture, do you prep? Do you consciously think about it, or does it just come naturally about, I'm going to interject this question from chapter 4 in lecture?
There's a lot of impromptu interjection, frankly. And part of that is just because I've been teaching this topic for so long that I'm super familiar. But I also know what tends to hang students up the most. So in areas where I know there's confusion, in areas where I know this little factoid tends to slip away more easily, those are the specific areas where I'm going to ask maybe a few more questions. And trying to pull that in so that all the students can answer it. So when I'm asking these questions too, I start really low calorie questions like, what's that organ again? Brain? Good job. You don't need me. So we start low. That's a question everybody can answer. What organ is that? I'm pointing at the brain. Everybody knows that. I mean, you don't even have to be in my class to know that. But then we start going up. So then I start challenging. And then I start challenging. And once I notice that like half the class can't answer anymore, maybe I'll ask a couple more questions. So then the students know this is where you need to be going. If you can't answer these questions, this is like the standard that you want to go towards. But if you can answer these questions, I'm gonna keep asking until most people can't answer, because I want to challenge the students that are at the top as well. So it really is the questioning mechanism is pretty specific. I try really hard to get through that challenge process from low to high, but also in those areas where I know, regardless of where you are as a student, this type of stuff tends to fall away faster.
So obviously in a lecture hall, when you're doing that, you're just throwing out questions to students. Now in the online world, how do you then interject those questions?
I do the same thing.
When
I'm lecturing, I will specifically ask questions. I will look at the camera and I'll be like, what do you guys think? Do you think it's this tissue or do you think it's that tissue? I mean, hopefully as they're watching, they're like, oh, in their head. And then I'll give it a second and I'll say, if you just said, nah, you'd be right. Or I'll say, if you said this is probably why you said that, but it's not quite right because. So I'll answer the question most of the time. But sometimes I don't answer the question. Sometimes I leave it as like a hanging question and they have to go get it. And guess what? Those are the questions I get in office hours. Those are the questions that come to me in the group me. Students will get on the group me and they'll be like, did y'all get that question? Does anybody else have an answer to like what she asked in the end of chapter 4, the clinical question? And then they all start discussing, and then I will jump in there and I'll be like, well, what about? So
Yeah.
it helps facilitate engagement as well
That's
when you do
good.
that. But it's just my lecture style. I ask a lot of questions. I try to be very Socratic when I'm doing it. And I try to do that as much online as I do residentially.
Okay.
Maybe a little bit less online because it's more programmed and planned.
Sure.
But definitely still a lot of questions.
Okay. So for our last segment, Tech Forward, what ways do you think would better help students to focus on what needs to be learned, and how can that information be retained?
So I think it's really important that we teach students how to use their learning objectives, which would require that we as instructors also use our learning objectives. I know a lot of faculty who do the course map process because they have to, and it's a box they have to check. But if you actually utilize it, it's super, 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 super helpful. It can keep you organized as you're going through, and you can also directly point students towards those. I tell my students there's no study guide for this course because you have learning objectives. Every assessment question that you encounter will be derived from those learning objectives. Now, what I end up getting from students is they will initially on the first exam tend to write out very explicit statements in like response to those learning objectives. And what that turns into is them not going far enough down the application lane. So you have to really teach them to apply the information that they get in the learning objective. So the content that you're learning is the learning objective. You need to know this. But this class is applied human anatomy or applied whatever. And so to test well, what you have to do is know the information in the learning objectives and get better at using it. So you have to teach students to do that process, right? You can't just expect that they're going to know how to apply things, how to think critically about things, how to read and analyze things critically or creatively. You can't assume that they're coming to you with that skill set. Some do, and that's fabulous, but many, many, many do not at all levels, even graduate levels. And so what I try really hard to do is teach them how to do that. And that's some of what we do with questions in class as well. Does it make sense that if this tissue is damaged, that's going to be the symptom? If we pick another tissue, could you make that same relationship in your mind? If on the exam I asked about this thing, would you be able to derive that it came from that thing? So helping students learn to use the learning objectives, the resources available to them to kind of give a baseline knowledge, but also then teaching them how to apply it. Once you start learning how to pull logic into the way you think about things and how you derive and synthesize, that's retentive. Now it has meaning to it. Now you can go, okay, if half that information is gone, do I have enough to fill in the blanks? Yeah. Yes, I do. So that is useful retention. You cannot possibly remember all the little details. I don't even remember all the little details. There are definitely times still 20 years into teaching anatomy that I'm like, oh no, I forgot the name of that thing. But it like will come to me based on the other things on the slide, the names. Okay, yes, got it back. Because the other things fill it in for me. And we have to teach students to do that. If we can teach them how to apply, teach them how to think critically about it, that's the type of retention that we need. We don't need them to memorize and just know the table. That is completely useless information. But knowing what they have a computer in their pocket. All of us have a computer in our pocket. There are certain things we just don't need to memorize anymore. But we do need to know how to use what we do have at our fingertips. So that for me is more important in terms of retention. When I am teaching students application skills, critical thinking skills, a lot of times this comes after the assessment. A lot of the times this comes in reviewing the assessment. Let's look at why you got that wrong. Can you tell me why you got that wrong? Can you look at the right answer now and tell me why that's the right answer? If you were going to make a fifth answer choice here as a distractor, pick one. What would you pick? What would be a good other answer? Seeing the four that I have here, one included is the right. What's a fifth one? What do you think else could I put there? And then talk about that. Like we have to actually teach them how to do this. If we just assume they're going to do it when they come to our classes, we are literally setting them up for failure. And that's really frustrating. And then they're going to hate you, and they're going to hate your course, and they're going to hate your content. And that's not good.
No. You brought up you often see them in maybe their first or second year, and then they become more and more on the professional medical route. have you heard from any of them once they get into like med school or anything like that?
Yeah. It's actually super funny. I get emails pretty regularly, at least a couple per semester, from students who've gone on into professional programs. Usually it's pre-med, but I've gotten emails from nurses, OTs, a lot of PTs as well from my major. And one of the things they often reflect back to me is that they're really surprised how many tissues they remember. And they even remember that it was chapter 4.
That's awesome. Everyone, we love chapter 4.
Chapter
4. Yes.
But it's so interesting to me. And I'm like, whenever I hear it, I'm like, yes, it worked. It worked.
I mean, it makes me feel better. I mean, anytime, we go to a doctor's appointment, you want people who remember things.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And that's the thing, too, is when you learn how to apply content, it automatically elevates your ability to communicate about those things. So this is another thing that we work on in my classes with regard to applications is being articulate about your ideas. One of the tips that I give students as they are learning this content is to not abbreviate things. Like you can abbreviate later, right? But learn the long one first, right? When we start teaching language, we don't start with contractions.
Right.
We don't say can't. We start with can not. And then eventually we shorten it up because we can. But that's because you learn the full thing first and then you back off. We do the same thing, or we should be doing the same thing with things that are really important to memorize. If we just say CSF, 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 at some point your brain's just going to be like, "What? It's CSF." Well, what is that?
Yeah, what is that?
Yeah, what is that? Exactly, cerebrospinal fluid.
Okay, got it.
But that's just it, that's what will happen to you when you take your test. Is when I say cerebrospinal fluid rather than CSF on your test, because I need you to know that's what that is, your brain is going to go, I don't know what that is. You do know what that is, but you don't recognize it. So we have to start giving our students ways that it actually teaches them the content rather than shortcuts.
Got it.
This is the era of shortcuts and convenience, right? So we have to find ways to like leverage that a little bit and convince them, right? Show them how meaningful it is to not have the shortcut first, then take the shortcut. I mean, this is not different too, right? When you were in elementary school, you're not allowed to use calculator because you got to learn how to do the actual process. Then when you're old enough, you already know your times table. Here's calculator. It's fine.
Sure.
Learn the long words. Use the long words. Say the long words to your friends. Make sure they understand what you're saying. And then at the end of the class, CSF.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ahlgren, for joining us, for sharing those tidbits with us. We hope that it helps all the listeners, and we look forward to next time.